always on 1 HP. 01 Mano says, wow. Ooh. Apothecant says. Un1 Max says, plus immunity. Mooney 142 says, sniffing the fuck out of that shirt. Clucklick says, nigga take it off then. It's Otto says, or drunk. Bowie Knife 69 says, boy it's just ultra hull. SmaQ Anders says, oh. DJRR 13 says. Tworin says, doo-doo water. And Shamame says, take the shirt off. Lukadov says, my first time out. Kira Tedbitch says, gone get sick just from Arky shirt. Who's Cryo says. Levi Shinpa says, fucking. Fleaburn says, the ride back home. DJRR 13 says. Bowie Knife 69 says, she did it to herself. J344 says, y'all both wasn't even that bad. Levi Shinpa says, and then she just didn't say a word on the ride back. Wheezy 525 says. Fleaburn says, toxic water. Sebastian 763 says, at Arky the ride back was so funny. Levi Shinpa says, I mean MNGL he was right. Nadida Mechanic J Amin says, as a land creature. Brawley 5000X says, I mean that's probably LA mixed sewer water. Spade 2904 says. SmaQ Anders says, Lamu. Faisal 0206 says. Levi Shinpa says, lol. 01 Mano says, lol. SmaQ Anders says, stare. DJRR 13 says. Jetbook says, she dissociating LMFAOO. Apothecant says. Crimzone says, didn't get sick ASF after 2. Fdog 98 says, was pistol mayo. Joe Jumbo 6969 says, no. Charmando says, traumatized. Nadida Mechanic J Amin says, complex emotional relationships then just end in laughter bro that's the best. Fleaburn says, her high overly blown. Purple Potatosack says, Arky. Thrag says, this is the day got the brain eating an Emba also. Sonder 122 says, soul left the body.
Please. Sobi.
5 Kings Rakuri says, this was last year what? Kundi 73 says, is he not going movies now? Beamfine says, movie. Confused says, fixed it it's a knob. Kundi 73 says, MF movies now. Charmando says, cold showers feel better anyway. Millennialsel says, temp on the heater is probably turned down. Who's Cryo says, always getting full. Green Ranger 00 says, you press a button. Mouse Datcheter says, no Spider-Man. Zingo C says, stop. DJRR 13 says. GD15H says, okay. It's Otto says, switched. Macavey Lee says, someone had to go in the pool today. Bowie Knife 69 says, TS a movie for Thanos. Fossabit says, it's 12:53 a.m. for Arky. Charmando says, Arky going to have that timing. Wiseman just says, nigga y'all not catching that movie. Wanna Cookie says, 25 minutes of NGL. Ter 562 says, 26 minutes of Formitade on that movie. Mouse Datcheter says, it's 1254. Fossabit says, get that yem off your face. L4RS3Y says, Arky showing up for the end credits scene. Moose and Muth says, girls can be tall too, Sonny. Who's Cryo says, you would be a small scrawny little same dude. Saunter 122 says, dead zone. Fdog 98 says, y'all should have taken the table out before building the walls. Itzkist says, Elbitred. Ter 562 says, it's probably elector-8 water heater, just turn it off and back on. Darlog says, go into the garage. Liz 100 says, F. Eilich 1 Co says, damn. 2 Smoker says, F. Jabless 43 says, classic. Liz 100 says, why is the Wi-Fi so bad there? Bowie Knife 69 says, prime. 2 Smoker says, good. Visol 0206 says, back. Unknown 123,777 says, done. Double Cross says, FYM. Travis with Arc says, no UG dad. Jabless 43 says, good. Double Cross says, lock her out. F1 Pug says, are we on clips? Mooney 142 says, what are you scared of? Bravi says, the boiler. Ter 562 says, just relight the pilot on the water heater. Joe Jumbo 6969 says, MF the lights are on. Jim S. Witterpig says, it's a fucking garage. Wiseman just says, scared to go in a garage. 2 Smoker says, let me get one. Striker 1256 says, that's a lot of iPads. Joe Jumbo 6969 says, oh. Remy Mahan says, but. Tiffbit says, 63Q. Enric 39 says, haha. Chubbs 25678 says, why is so small? Agentrax says, yo Arky, can I get a? NRG Abner says, Sina. Charmando says, when the cleaning the garage segment. 01 Mano says, hi. Silk It Up says, love from New Zealand, and Arky. Nadivamet Janik J. Amin says, that's gas line. Jabless 43 says, either the pilot light is out of the circuit breaker tripped. DJRR 13 says. NRG Abner says, damn lock and Sinna. Ter 562 says, look in the window, can you see a flame at Arky? Club 3 says, can't even read it. Number 107 says, red at Arky. Lukadov says, IDK mine in my house is old ASL, you got this though. Saunter 122 says, it's the flight confused one at Arky. Melanie Alsel says, use AI. Jonas Alone says, Harlan Ox says, ChatGTT. Who's Cryo says, scolding. Number 107 says, show. 01 Mano says, so basically. SL0PPYG0 Blur says, so basically if you look at the leftmost part it says put in on the go fuck yourself. Number 107 says, at Arky just a bit. Agentrax says, don't put IT max. Number 107 says, and Arky you just a bit. Ter 562 says, just the flame going up to heat it up. DJRR 13 says, cold showers are best. Mass N7 says, don't push it up too much. Nadivamet Janik J. Amin says, bruh boiling point is 100. Doc says, buzz. Is Isaiah says, that's not air, that gas. Emery Steele says, turn it to hot. Green Ranger 00 says, is that a gas or electric heater? Solace Amure says, GG everybody bound to die. Mouse Datcheter says, Umeo why is it wet? Darlog says, go clockwise. Sala Samurai says, El Plumber Arc. Just T148 says, PLZ hire someone to do this. Zingo C says, well. Number 107 says, new. Blade says, oh. Nadivamechanik J Amin says, pressure. Tebook says, put it like 70% between warm and hot.
这个方法
Sala Samurai says, boiled incoming. Wana Cookie says, ask ChatGPT. Kala2 says, that thing bout it explode. 98 Moses says, increase
这
it
个方法直接改
halfway.
了啊
Ninja Magic
直接改成
says,
意思啊
you guys legit will blow up the house
Okay,
if
cool.
gas leak. Kala2 says, auto cue the boom. Bell 23 says, law. Number 107 says, you. Jose I says, fuck you. Younglug says, ChatGTT looking up. Clumsyboy07 says, that actually got me. Emery Steele says, that's not how water works. Immunity says, 20% movement. Not Ginny says, go test it. Emery Steele says, more hot. Shishpa says, go test. Number 107 says, go check. Sebastian Two says, LOL. Remy Mahan says, no Ron?
Ashley G's. No Ronaldo.
你们开始吧，我看
Jabless43 says, it's okay.
开了。
241 says,
Yeah.
at least he's stable. Mass N7 says, nah you didn't. It's Otto says, waiting on Santi to pick him up to go to the movies. Immunity says, wall hole. Zingosi says, for the vacuum. Evada Fresh says, it will take 23 hours to change. Real Bart Cart says, built-in vacuums. Atin Trax says, no don't put your hand in there.
Real Bart Chart mengatakan, nah,
DJRR13 says. Arjoltian says, that's exactly what I was thinking. Unknown 123,777 says, Niji what are you on? Torin says, it's not gonna arc instantly. Disectate says, we need further testing. Nanamiawamiyaw says, it's gonna take at least 30 to 40 minutes. Jabless43 says, 30 to 40 minutes. Indo Silver says, it hasn't even been 5 minutes. Jabless43 says, it's gonna take a while. Who's Cryo says, Trey. Cluckwick says, Tray Room. Stream Element says, 6 times combo. Charmando says, ice not leaving that on a fire hazard. Jabless43 says, it's gonna take time. Pro Scenario says, I'd say 1 hour because it's a big house. Bowie Knife 69 says, that tub needs some french fries. Mooney 142 says, why did the POV just drop? Real Bart Cart says, sauna? You got a damn sauna. Lucky ass bro. Atin Trax says, nah whoever goes in there they straight noodles GNG. Unknown 123,777 says, his room is 2 times yours. Nadivamechanik J Amin says, I got like 3 minutes RN. Itzkist says, ooh shit. 4VI says, Bro turned on the cold mayo. Blue Benjamin says, she put you on game. Pro Scenario says, left knob is hot. Jabless43 says, it takes time. Story 2026 says, water pressure WTF. Evada Fresh says, you have to wait. Joe Jumbo 6969 says, sir. Evada Fresh says, it's not instant. Purple Zomb says, the whole tank has to heat up in the garage. RMN says, Spence. Immunity says, so weak heat travels instantly. Casket says, still in the hood basically. Newton Blade says, y'all not real. Is Isaiah says, your water is boiling right now. Sleepy Sabo says, 10 minutes. Real Bart Cart says, it's a pot of hot water. NRG Abner says, Arky better than the other guy. Hobby CS says, bro is actually a child. Case 2025 says, let it cook first. Sleepy Sabo says, 10 minutes. Newton Blade says, Canada and USA education. Manalis of Elia says, have to let it run. Number 107 says, go test. Nadiva Mechanic J. Amin says, jump in the fire. I forgot. Bell 23 says,
是，不可能小都拉满了。哦，有了，一点点。这也太小了吧！我的天啊，这搞成这样了。等一下，我把这个关一下。等一下，我把插头的关一下。
不是你
还代码里是吧？
在哪里？它肯定是影响了，知道吧？这个东西它是互相影响。
声音直接减小了。
看这里，看这里，三个，对，三个。如果很多这个玩意儿还能画下，赵老师想办法做一个一点说的这个出来。时间到时候其实下面还要提供，要把这个可以放。就是所有的事情啊，就是他那个，就是你要加八，就是加八肯定不能放在这个，你要放在你要把时间放在这个里面的话，那你看不到它稍后就不要加我稍后我直接然后这个就是看行为的。就是担心风险太多，现在说也可以稍微加一个10的话，再20万。那个时候我需要这种，可以，这样我就选中了一个。内容和这个出的还不一样，因为你看嘛，这个我们只做了一个事件的发生的时间点，因为你要推出来的话，你一直是把所有的过滤类似嘛，这样杀人。对，我只看那一个事件发生的时间线。然后我们先用一段时间看这个。那这先看上，不行就先画好。这样，其实我们到时候用起来可以看到我们主要关注的是哪几个原因，然后再看看希望你现在是你这样一点，我感觉最关注的点，要是我用的话，肯定是先找到退流。这是第一步。找退流的话，我直接跳转到我退流的地方，那么它有可能它说明时间时候原来是这样的，对吧？就是进去了它没有退流，就是对了，那我点击我的退流，我直接调到这个退流的地方，我看这个退流的期间有没有什么错。看我这1点这个默认是